In my last videos, I was talking about the role of self-worth, and we're wondering if anybody has ever talked to you about self-worth. If you know what that means, and if you know about the connection between self-worth and self-esteem, and if you know if there's any difference between one or the other. And this part is part 2, I suppose, of the story on self-worth that I wrote. And as you can see, the books are piling up all around me here, just to let you know that I'm not making this stuff up. This is actually academic information that's presented in institutions of higher learning, universities and colleges. Anyways, we'll carry on with the story here. Carrying on with the story of self-worth, the Roman Empire, Dr. Fred Shore tells me, was in the business of indentured services or slavery, capturing slaves and selling them like chattel or property. Indentured servitude is a hierarchical and class structure with authoritarian ideology, a system of centralized power which is structured like a pyramid. A slave or property and a slave owner or property owner. Dr. Peter Kolchiski describes this in his book, Aboriginal Rights Are Not Human Rights, in defense of indigenous struggles. The empire developed law to regulate rights and privileges of persons and non-persons with many proofs. Slaves would petition the local magistrates for their rights and freedoms. In the story of Western civilization, no empire operated without the use of indentured service. Regulated in class stratified societies, hierarchical with a king or a queen at the pinnacle of the pyramid, all would bow and pay homage. When the empires arrived in North and South America, as well as areas around the world, the assimilated had thousands of years of social engineering in the way of indentured servitude, and they knew nothing else. In the books Myth of the Savage by Olive Patricia Dickinson and Skyscrapers Hide the Heavens, A History of Native Newcomer Relations in Canada, 4th edition by J.R. Miller, we are told about the contributions of indigenous people on the empire. The indentured servants of the empires had no concept of freedom until they met what they called Indians. Dickinson and Miller quote historically preserved documents written in their own words, the imperialist descriptions of what they witnessed when the empires entered first contact. So it's not really true to say that they had no concept of freedom, but that they did have concepts of freedom. Indians, as they were, and still are called, contributed more to our modern world than just land and resources. North and South American Indians taught new arrivals concepts of freedom and liberalism, philosophies, economics, games and entertainment, songs and dances, and they were impressed with food stocks used for traditional feasts and giveaways, which happened often. Colonizers wrote about civilizations rich in complexity and progress, freedoms, liberalisms, noting especially how rich in freedom the Indian was, and how they answered to no one, and never asked for permission. Noteworthy among their writings was how much power women held in the community. Nothing happened without women letting it happen. Also, there were young people, always involved in decision-making. Women chiefs and young people are often absent from the writings because we know that empires were patriarchal and authoritarian. To them, women were worthless and youth dispensable. Miller describes Indian people as the cleverest business-minded traders that knew how to make a profit, how to engage in trade embargo, how to negotiate in the most intelligent manner that would put Wall Street to shame, it would seem. The Indian most certainly put the best and brightest imperialists to shame during the great fur trade. Nothing moved unless the Indian allowed for it, and they allowed for it only when there was profit. Colonizers wrote about how envious they were of these freedoms, that Indians enjoyed, and many Frenchmen ran away from the empires to live among Indians and in time formed a new people called Canadiens, Miller writes. Indians didn't pay taxes, and the Frenchman paid heavy taxes and was always overworked. The assimilated wrote about how little work Indians did, and that's how the lazy Indian myth began. When Indians didn't need to work so hard, they believed it was an abomination. Whereas the colonizers had a Christian's work ethic, they believed in and they practiced tithing, or else it was imposed. You might be surprised to know that it was Iroquois women who invented the miniskirt. French colonists were aghast at the sight of how little clothing Indians wore in comparison to their conservative religious traditions. It took them a while, but now the miniskirt is one of the greatest inventions and contributions to humanity, as it represents freedom and liberation to the assimilated. Colonizers wrote about how sexually liberated Indian people were. And I'm talking about American Indians and South American Indians, not Indians from India, just to be sure. The French Empire was defeated by the British Empire, but not before the Indian had time to share culture in ways with Francophone society, and now Quebec is known for its sexual liberation, but all of France, too, is known for it as well. In terms of freedom concepts, the Indians shared the greatest contribution to the world, which would not likely have ever been attainable under authoritarian hierarchical class structures of patriarchy, and that was the teachings of dignity and human rights. Russell Means talks about constitutional law being Indian law. Means tells us that the United States of America got its ideas for the United States Constitution and concepts of democracy from the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. We all know that you can't have a democracy without a constitution, and that recognizes human rights, dignity, and self-worth of the individual. These are concepts that were foreign to colonizers who eventually learned something of their worth, dignity, and stood up against their oppressors, fought for their freedom and independence in the great wars against empires. You can find Russell Means describing this on YouTube with a quick search. Finally, in terms of contributions that Indian people shared with humanity, including freedom, democracy, independence, and human rights, notwithstanding the miniskirt and other liberations, there remains cultural appropriation issues. The assimilation schools would never credit the Indian with these enormous contributions to humanity, and so it is taught this was all part of the progress of civilization and humanity. Not likely. Later, scientists would appropriate sacred teachings of indigenous people without crediting their source, and Abraham Maslow is one such individual to present the hierarchy of needs as his very own idea. Well, his version is his own, that's true, but he wasn't alone in developing his presentation. Dr. Cindy Blackstock recognized Maslow's theory as a traditional and sacred teaching of the Blackfoot Nation, where Maslow uses a pyramid rather than a lodge. The Blackfoot Nation and their teachings have been around for before civilizations even began, before the time of the construction of the Tower of Babel, and that's how we know Maslow hadn't discovered anything new. It is apparent to anyone who understands anything can see how much Indian people have contributed to our present world in profoundly significant ways, but never get the credit they deserve. Instead, myths are taught, and racism, which permeates our world, appropriates the contributions of all people in the guise of progress and civilization. So that concludes part 3. And thank you once again. Please like, share, and subscribe.